In 1863, Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, fueling the fire between states who encouraged slavery and those that strictly opposed the practice. African Americans virtually had no voice and no political or economic stance, leaning on national figures to look after them. Oppression began with slavery, then rose to hostility, lynching, physical abuse, and laws that sought to keep African Americans down even after their freedom had been granted. It wasn't until Martin Luther King Jr. took the stage that civil rights movements exploded into action. King accepted leadership in the first African American nonviolent act of retaliation, boycotting the buses. After the protest, King was arrested, subject to physical abuse, and his house was bombed. However, this was good publicity for King, and he emerged as a leader for civil rights. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference elected King president in 1957, aiming to protect the growing civil rights movement. For King, this was just the beginning. His retaliation was recognized worldwide, and he traveled the country, giving speeches anytime there was injustice. He was assassinated on the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, April 4, 1968. King fought not for himself, but for the common good of everyone. Despite physical abuse, hardship, and persecution, nothing could keep him from fighting. One of the most iconic and massive nonviolent demonstrations was the Montgomery bus boycott. By 1955, African Americans were still being discriminated against and denied the basic rights of freedom. Montgomery, Alabama, city ordinance stated that the back of public buses were to be reserved for African Americans, and in the event that the front half of the bus, exclusively reserved for whites, was full, blacks were required to give up their seat. 9 months before the popular Rosa Parks incident, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat to a white rider and was arrested. Black leaders in Montgomery were prepared for protest. When it was discovered that Colvin was pregnant, it was decided she was an inappropriate figure to carry the protest. It wasn't until Rosa Parks, too, refused to give up her seat that the bus boycott began. 4 days after Parks' arrest, African Americans began to commute by means other than the city bus. They walked, carpooled, and took taxis instead. Even though African Americans accounted for 75% of bus riders, the city was reluctant to change their policies. While in jail, Parks called upon a man named Edgar Nixon, who was responsible for bailing Parks out of jail. He also set up Parks' case to make changes to segregation laws. While the boycott raged on, Nixon and Parks fought in the courts to change legislation, along with 5 Montgomery women and leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. After 382 days of retaliation, the Supreme Court finally ruled segregation on buses unconstitutional, that it violated the 14th Amendment, which states that all citizens are guaranteed equal protection and equal rights under state and federal law, regardless of race. Despite these efforts, integration was still not accepted. The Ku Klux Klan targeted African American leaders, as well as churches, and bombed several establishments, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s residence. While Edgar Nixon played a crucial role in the bus boycott, he was also an important civil rights activist. He organized and became president of the Montgomery Voters League, and led protest marches to get rights for African Americans. He was promoted to president of the entire Alabama branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Nixon is also responsible for recruiting Martin Luther King Jr., recognizing his talents as a leader, and bringing him to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Nixon led by example. He was able to recognize good leadership qualities in others, and brought in new people that strengthened civil rights movements. Nonviolence became popular due to Martin Luther King Jr., who was inspired by Gandhi's success with nonviolence. Despite this common practice, many people believe that nonviolence was too slow to demand change and required too much personal assault and battery. Stokely Carmichael was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and moved to New York when he was still a child. It wasn't until high school, when he caught sight of sit-ins, that he felt insatiable desire to join the movements. It was then that he joined the Congress of Racial Equality and traveled through the states retaliating with nonviolence. All throughout college, Carmichael participated in protests, strikes, freedom rides, everything he could get involved in. 1965 was the Freedom Summer, as labeled by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Carmichael joined the committee, fond of their aggressive campaign. He worked at raising the number of registered black voters, and even managed to raise the number 300 higher than the amount of registered white voters. Unsatisfied with the lack of recognition from other parties about his efforts, Carmichael formed his own party, Lowndes County Freedom Organization, of which the logo was a Black Panther. Once Carmichael was elected national chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he felt he had suffered enough physical abuse with too little reward. With the nonviolent protests were taking too long to create change. Carmichael wanted to take a new direction with his position as chairman. It began when James Meredith began a lonely march called the Walk Against Fear, starting in Memphis, Tennessee, with his destination set in Jackson, Mississippi. 20 miles into Mississippi, Meredith was shot. Carmichael was furious and demanded that the SNCC take his place. He delivered a speech in which he said, "We've been saying freedom for 6 years. What are we going to start saying now is black freedom?" This sparked a whole new revolution of activists and protesters. One of the most profound and well-known supporters of Black Power is Malcolm X. Childhood for Malcolm X was rough. He grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, where the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups targeted black families. Even when the family moved to Michigan, the harassment did not cease. Malcolm X spread the idea of the Nation of Islam and brought in 20,000 newly converted activists ready to gain their rights by any means necessary, violence included. This idea of black power brought in young people who were ready for a fight, who knew what they wanted and expected to get it. Old colleague Martin Luther King Jr. was strongly opposed to the new teachings of Malcolm X and urged others that nonviolent, peaceful integration was the way to go. The fight for civil rights began with the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, which ruled separate but equal facilities unconstitutional. 9 years later, President John F. Kennedy wanted to pass civil rights legislation, but soon after was shot. Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon B. Johnson were left to carry on with the Civil Rights Act, which was successfully passed in 1964. The act outlawed all prevention of African Americans to vote, as well as discriminatory employment practices, public facilities, and education. King was overjoyed and lived with the remaining 4 years of his life as a free man without prejudice.